Welcome to the history of Lithuania. Hello, and welcome back to the third episode of the history of Lithuania. We have been gone longer than usual, and for good reason. Last time we talked about one of the most important parts in the creation of a nation, their language. We recently came back from Šiauliai, the mini culture capital of Lithuania, and we're expecting to bring you back the knowledge and beauty of the early Baltic people's religion. Another very important puzzle piece in the grand design. Today I'll start off by discussing what gods they worshipped, how they did it, what was important or unique, and finally, we'll move on to some interesting pieces of trivia. What I want to do is do a little bit of world building around the pantheon and finish off with information that might not be as widely available as it should be. One last thing we wish to announce before we jump right in is that now we have an Instagram account. The handle is History of Lithuania 1009. We'll try to post periodically, and if you wish to interact with us, now you can. Speaking of, we have a question from a listener concerning our last episode, which I will address in a moment. Anyways, on to the episode. Okay, so the question was from Gabriele, and she asks, why do women's surnames change in certain languages, added Iene or Aya, but male surnames do not? A quick explanation. Iene or Aya is a common end of Lithuanian women's surnames that indicates their marital status. So we did a little bit of research, and the short answer would be because of the patriarchy and the Catholic Church. The long answer is that women in Lithuania actually had more freedom when taking on their husbands' names, or not, prior to the 19th century. It is known that women could actually choose to have both their surnames and their husbands as early as the 15th century. It only became less popular with an increasing influence of religion in Lithuania. But even in the 19th century, it was not widely liked that women should have Iene or Aya endings, as it was considered to be less intellectual. I hope that gives a better idea as to why it is, and just to conclude, simply because of Christian traditions. Right, on to the Baltic gods. Before we jump in and start talking about all of these gods, we have the moral obligation to warn you. The information that we gathered could be at one point or another be deeply affected by Christianization of Lithuania or any other history-altering facts. Even when we were walking through the park and checking out the information stands about the gods, there were numerous mentions of things like, this god was worshipped during the baptisms of children, or this creature was later used as a bad omen for pagans, most likely meaning they redefined mythological beings for the purpose of weakening faith in pagan gods and creatures or making them as close as possible to Christian ones. A lot of the gods share a lot of similarities with better preserved pantheons, such as the pantheon of Scandinavian or Germanic gods. That is why we can still make educated guesses as to which part could be unaffected. For example, both Greek and Scandinavian people had the god of thunder, Zeus, and Thor. And thus, the Balts also had such a god called Perkūnas, who was also a patriarchal figure in the mythology and literally translates as thunderer. What further complicates things is that most of the scripture we have about the Baltic religions are written in the 15th and 14th centuries. By that time, Lithuania was already Christianized, and the people writing these scriptures were missionaries who sought to destroy the roots of paganism in Lithuania. So we have relatively little objective information left, but we can still try to present what we might think could be true. For the most part of what I will be talking about, I'll be citing or interpreting an article published by Haraldas Biezais, Baltic Religion in Britannica, his other historical texts, Wikipedia, our personal experience from when we were learning about these things at school, and of course our experience in Šiauliai. Finally, after all the intros, let's start and try to describe what the Baltic world could have looked like. To begin, let's try to paint a better picture of the world as seen by the Balts. They believed that world consisted of either two or several distinct parts. If we think about other religions of the time, it is more likely that there were several worlds that we don't know about. But it is more widely believed that there were only two, as per the principle of duality. These parts included the lands where they resided, so basically the earth and everything around them, and the underworld where the sun went at night. It was also probably believed that the underworld was the land of the dead, even though when we will start talking about the gods further, you might notice that it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It remains uncertain or difficult to say if the Balts perceived Earth as spherical, but they did hold the belief that the sun went beneath the world in a chariot drawn by horses. The Balts also held the belief of a vast ocean, or more commonly referred to as the primordial waters, or at least something similar to that, with a world tree situated at its center. Their concept of the sky involved viewing it as a mountain where the gods resided, on which they had their farmsteads. I personally find that very interesting. The Balts did in fact see the gods as just some other people living up in the sky in their farmstead. The image of the gods were, in my opinion, very normalized compared to other polytheistic religions of the time, where gods were seen as beings of immense power rather than ranchers in the sky. It's plausible that the Balts regarded the earth as flat, given references to Sarla's journey beneath the earth during nighttime. But the fact that Balts had a concept of the world's ocean, they most likely thought the world to be a round plate. And due to the reasons given, we cannot definitely say how the Balts might have seen Earth. In summary, although our knowledge of the Balts' world remains somewhat lackluster, we can imagine a vague picture. People inhabited the land, the sky represented a mountain hosting very powerful gods, or at least powerful for them, including Saule, the sun, responsible for the day and night cycle. A vast ocean that likely existed in the distant reaches of the world, with a mysterious World 3 at its center, perhaps serving a similar function to that of the Scandinavian mythologies, in upholding the entire world. We also gathered that they probably believed in an underworld where the sun traveled during the night, also believed to perhaps have been the world of the dead. So now that we know how more or less the Balts believed the world to be like, we can move on to discussing the actual gods and creatures of that time. Before I begin my introduction to Baltic gods, I want to give a shout out to our 50th follower, Emilia, or Vipzone on Instagram. The difficult part begins here, when we talk about the gods of Lithuanian folklore. Why is it difficult? Well, mostly because of what we already discussed. A lot of the gods might have been used by Christianization-seeking individuals to either make Balts turn against the old religion or use it to further their own cause. We of course cannot say for sure if any of the ideas presented are true, or at least not falsified throughout history, but we have somewhat of a reason to believe that it might not be. So let us dive in. First off, let's talk about Dievs, the main god of the Baltic folklore. We talked a lot about him with Paulus, and we came to a conclusion that out of all the ordinary folk at the time, Dievs was an image of someone being the best at being ordinary. He was seen as a very good keeper of his own farmstead. He did not work too much himself, but was rather very good at delegating jobs to others. Looking at it, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, why wouldn't someone who's just good at keeping everything running smoothly be considered the absolute of the godly domain? That's definitely what the Balts themselves had to do most of the time. We unfortunately could not find information how he might have been worshipped, but you'll soon notice a trend with Balts that had very specific rites concerning each god, so we suspect that he had something similar, but unfortunately we cannot tell you what exactly. Right, we can move on to Perkunas, the god of thunder. In some sources, war, in some the god of the smith, and sometimes even the keeper of all that is good. It is also not exactly clear what his function might have been, and mistakenly he is considered by today's standards to be the patriarch god, but in fact that is not true, as Dievas or Dievs serves that purpose in the pantheon. He is unmistakably described as a creature of great military power. He is associated with war, which also makes a lot of sense, as the Balts were in fact quite militaristic. In school, we learned that Perkunas is at a never-ending fight with the Velnas, the Baltic equivalent of the devil, or plainly the bad guy. but that might not be true. We know for sure that his importance has been inflated heavily by Christianization. For what reason, it is difficult to say. He is also associated with rain, which again makes a lot of sense, as the Baltic people were very agricultural. It was especially important to sacrifice during droughts or plagues. He is also believed to have been incredibly important at any celebrations. Sacrifices were thought to have been plenty, although we again cannot say for sure how they were made. Let us proceed to talking about another important part of the religion, the goddesses of the sky. These three goddesses I will be talking about, Saule, Aušrinė, and Vakarinė, are actually very tightly knit, and I will be putting them all together. It is actually quite a paradox surrounding these three, as there is just so much information about them, but I feel like that mostly that information is probably not true, or at least very heavily influenced by Christianization or other sources. Saule is the Lithuanian word for the sun, and it is no secret that many religions of the world had the sun as a grand or in any other way important deity. It is no exception for the Balts. Saule, Aušrinė, and Šiaurinė go hand in hand, and the mythology around them is quite beautiful. It was believed that while the sun carries over the sky and brings joy, Aušrinė takes care of the sun in the morning by doing various household chores such as starting the fire, boiling water, etc., while Vakarinė makes the bed and lays the sun to rest. Of course, Aušrinė and Vakarinė are most likely the equivalents of the North Star and Venus, also believed to have been used for navigation. The role of the sun is very matriarchal in the mythology. A huge cult is also believed to have existed due to numerous hymns still left over to this day. Let us move on to the husband of Saule, Mėnulis. Mėnulis, translated from Lithuanian to English, means the moon. Not a lot can be said about him. Historically, he might have been the Baltic god of war and is associated with some Indo-Iranian religious characters. The fact about his connection to war is due to him being described as dressed in clothing similar to that of Baltic warriors, having tools for wars, etc. Other than that, in modern mythology, he is considered to be the husband of the sun, is generally depicted sleepy, associated with the calm, which is a bit funny as originally he was most likely associated with the complete opposite. He most likely had a much bigger role, but we just do not know about it. Other religions definitely personify the moon a lot, and as we can see from the gods described up to this point, sky objects held high importance in the Baltic tradition. Unfortunately, I will not be able to invent any stories about him, so let us move on to another. The next creature I wish to discuss is Žemėna, another important Baltic deity by today's standards, but whose existence during Baltic tribe times is questionable. Situation with Žemėna is confusing. Some historians tend to believe that she was actually an image of Virgin Mary that somehow seeped into the mythology, but just in case she wasn't, I'd like to talk about her a little bit. Žemėna in mythology is described somewhat as the mother of the earth. She is believed to have brought life, is associated with fertility, nurture, etc. I can definitely see how she might have been purely a figment of Christianization, as their roles are somewhat, or at least at the base level, very similar. Not much is known about her. She's mentioned only a few times. It is of course interesting how Žemėna or Žemyna is such an important part of the mythology today. If you visit Lithuania, you'll notice that it is not an uncommon practice to name things after her: bus stops, streets, brand names, and so on. Let us diverge from the classical gods for a bit and talk about a single mythological creature that is so very important in both current Lithuanian culture and was most likely very important in the Baltic tradition. The name Kaukas is very familiar to a lot of Lithuanians. There is unfortunately no direct translation to English. The Balts believe Kaukas to be the spirit of the house, another being that I find very believable to have existed at the time. Kaukai are generally believed to be good spirits who bring good fortune to a household. Again, makes a lot of sense, as Baltic life was centered a lot around communities, tribes, prosperity of a household, etc. It is also believed that they could have had the ability to duplicate items, such as money or food. The interesting thing about them is that there is likely no other creature that could have been so heavily affected by other religions as Kaukai. What I mean by that is that if you ever happen to read anything about them in Lithuania, they take over roles of a lot of Western culture beings, such as gnomes, goblins, trolls, lubberkins, porinics in the Slavic mythology, imps, or fairies. The evidence that suggests they existed just says that they were good spirits of the house, nothing like the aforementioned creatures. Interestingly, they are also sometimes used as scary stories for children who misbehave. Another very important character in Baltic mythology is Žirgas, or translated to English, horses. Horses seem to hold a special place in the mythology. Horses draw the carriage of Saule. White horses were believed to have been an indication that a god had visited a pasture. It could be explained by the fact that a horse was incredibly expensive at the time, costing a single entire Baltic long, a type of currency used at the time, made mostly of silver. In some cases, it was believed that seeing a white horse in your pasture would bring you a huge harvest, and thus a practice of leaving bread and beer on your farmland was common, or at least believed to have been common. Speaking of pastures and lands, let us discuss the most, or at least in my opinion, one of the most important deities in Baltic religion. In general, there are just so many of them that I will refer to them collectively as deities of harvest. The reason I wish to talk about them specifically is because, according to historians, the Balts were very big on worshipping anything that helped them reap a better harvest. There is a lot of gods associated specifically with just the tending of a land, and I think it would not make an interesting story to talk about them exclusively. Rather, I will just say that most of them likely did exist, either pre or after Christianization, but their function is ultimately more or less the same, to help with crop yields. It is likely that each tribe had their own name for their own god. There were even gods that were associated with only one type of grain, for instance, god of wheat, god of flax, linen, etc. We do somewhat actually know how these gods might have been worshipped. During our visit, we saw a few gods specifically associated with harvests, and they all had their own exclusive ways of worship. Let's take one of them, for example. His name was Lauksargis, which is translated as the guardian of the land. And basically, how the Balts worshipped him is it was said that they used specifically twin oxes to plow fields to attract him. The Balts believed that by using twin oxes, the lands would be better protected against wolves, against Herbros, and generally just any bad luck. Of course, unfortunately, it is very difficult to prove this, as there is simply no written records, just legends. Another very important part of Baltic religion were the water deities. There is a deity for the rivers, the lakes, the seas, and even the waves in the ocean. Their existence is a bit questionable, but we perhaps are more or less aware how they could have been sacrificed to. For instance, Upinis, which is roughly translated as river god or a person of the river, might have received white goats from the Balts as sacrifices. It was especially common to sacrifice in places of bathing or near or over bridges. Again, very difficult to confirm or deny these claims, but I think it's worth mentioning as it's interesting and it kind of fits into the world quite well. And finally, the last but not least, and also very, very important deity in the Lithuanian mythology, Velnias or Velinas. The direct translation would be the devil, but that feels a bit Christianized, so I will just refer to him as Velinas from now on. He's most often characterized for his evil deeds and his fight with Perkūnas, but only in the modern parts of the mythology. Originally, he may have held a much more important role. Modern Lithuanian mythologists absolutely love Velinas. He's the center of attention in a lot of myths. He has very specific characterization, and also there's even a museum dedicated exclusively to him in Lithuania, which is actually quite famous. He is most often depicted as having long horns, a tail, goat's legs, is afraid of roosters, and is easily tricked. If that sounds familiar, it should be. It's a very Western depiction of the devil. The original Velnias of the Baltic religion probably had a lesser role, but is still associated with the land of the dead. The Balts believed in the afterlife called Vėlės. Both the word Velnias, or in some cases Velinas, and Vėlės share a similar root. Thus, it leads me to believe that they are exclusively connected, or that Velinas might have held a role in the underground world in the Baltic religion. A fun fact is that during the Christmas feast, it is common practice to leave any unfinished food on the table for the dead to feast on, which might have come from Baltic religion, as they used to do something similar during celebrations, even going as far as leaving empty chairs around the table for the past. For now, this is the last god and or Baltic creature that I'm going to discuss. let us move on to discussing how the religion was practiced or could have been practiced. Later, I will come back to the topic of gods, discussing pseudo ones, the ones that might have existed but we don't really have concrete proof that they did. Up to this point, I heavily avoided saying that this is exclusively Lithuanian mythology, and soon you'll notice why. But to hint at it, a lot of practices by the Balts seemed somewhat similar, or at least depicted much better in the Western countries, such as Poland or Scandinavia. Also, the religions are shared amongst Prussia and Latvia, as they were also part of the Baltic tribes. In this segment, I won't go too much into details about anything, and rather talk about some information that is interesting or in general gives a better idea of how the Balts worshipped their gods. Let's start off with society. Religion might have been deeply knit into society, as suggested by the fact that it is not unheard of for widows or soldiers to commit suicide after lost battles. This was a very shocking piece of trivia at first, as there is absolutely no mention of this in the traditional school systems, but it would actually make a lot of sense, as it seems that Balts did believe in the afterlife. It seems that the Baltic religion did not follow a specific hierarchy, or it is at least unknown if there were any significant religious patriarchs or matriarchs to guide people. Although, from later times, for instance, in the first book written in Lithuanian, which called to renounce the old gods, it is mentioned that people of Lithuania should stop believing herbalists, sorcerers, and all kinds of other pagan figures. So we can somewhat reasonably believe that there were a certain part of society that lived exclusively by pagan traditions. As the entire religion was not centralized, it did not follow absolutes. Burial was different for every tribe. We know that some tribes practiced traditional burials, others did Viking funerals, and some used good old-fashioned pyres to burn the fallen. Non-centralization also led to the Balts not having places like churches, but rather right places. They were usually wooden domes up to 5 meters in length and width. Inside it, there would usually be a wooden statue of the god that was being worshipped. These places were built in forests, and some of them can still be found around Lithuania. Of course, we can only know of them from leftover sacrificial stone pedestals. Another very important place for the Balts were bathhouses. According to sources, it was the closest place to a church that they had. It was an important part of society, as it was a place where children were born, marriages were arranged, celebrations celebrated. Some tribes in current-day Latvia even had a god associated specifically with bathhouses and saunas. As we established before, elements were very important for the Balts, but fire holds a special place in the religion. It was seen as the great cleanser, sacrifices were made to it frequently. In fact, you could ask any Lithuanian if they know who the god of water, earth, or wind is, and you'd either get no answer or an answer that is very doubtful. But ask about the fire goddess, and I'm certain everyone would be able to tell you. The goddess of fire, Gabia, is for some reason so deeply etched into our culture that it has become a very common woman's name too. In fact, the trend of personification of everyday things was very common for the Balts. The reason being, they believed that gods in some way resided within their homes, for instance, in doorways, hearts, and dark corners of the home. Although this belief could have arisen from Christianization. And lastly, I'd like to talk about pseudo-gods as I promised. It is important to note the existence of pseudo-gods in most sources, gods that were not in the original Baltic mythology, but got integrated into the folklore, either through miscommunication of the Christian priests who did not know the language of the local people, but still integrated the names of the local gods into their works through a Catholic worldview perspective, or by the local people when presented with all the different saints of Christianity. In their minds, they were their own independent gods, each with its own name, which sometimes got changed beyond recognition. And a final reason was quite plain: researchers inventing pseudo-gods just to show off. And they somehow managed to leak into the mythology, people started believing them, and now we have them. So, I will give you some examples. Let's start with Kelukis, god of the roads, believed to be a guide for nomads and traveling people. If you've been following so far, you would probably have noticed that this god doesn't really make a lot of sense. Why would the Balts have a nomadic god? They were not nomads at the time, and if that is not enough, well, we really cannot find any sources of him actually existing. What we do know of him is that people used to sacrifice a white hen and wish for a good start and an end of a journey. That was a god that was likely non existent just because, well, it doesn't really fit into the whole mythology as a whole. But there are many gods in Baltic mythology that are so similar to Greek gods, it just doesn't make sense how they could have existed in Baltic religion. Let's start with Babylos, depicted as a fat, hairy, and a very horny god. To me, in essence, he just sounds absolutely like Dionysus. During our visit to Cholet, his statue sure captivated us, but truth be told, it is very unlikely that such a god ever existed, partly because, again, no written records, and too similar to Roman Greek counterparts. Another god very similar to Babylos is Lome, a creature very reminiscent of nymphs, believed to have been goddesses of forests or rivers, often depicted as bathing during twilights below birch trees. They could either be a misinterpreted story or a fiction of someone's imagination during the writings of the history of Lithuanian mythology. But there are some gods who have a very unique backstory. For instance, Epideme, the goddess of abandoned settlements. I decided to talk about her because, in essence, a deity like her could have existed, because the word actually has meaning in Lithuanian. Epideme means a place with black soil and old trees. She also had a connection to the hearth of a home, but not exactly clear what. The hearth is a recurring theme in the religion. Thus, even though there are little sources, it is still interesting to think about such a creature existing in the mythology. And the last two pseudo-gods that I want to mention is Alcis and Prekorimas, which both do not have a direct translation, but one of their names could have a meaning in Lithuanian. I decided to mention these two gods as they are the only gods mentioned in the mythology to have been giants. Other than them, there is absolutely no other mention of giants existing in the Baltic religion. One is believed to be some sort of an equivalent for Hermes. His name is connected to the word alga, or in English, wage. He was also believed to be the messenger for the gods. Prekorimas holds a much more significant role as the creator and keeper of faith. He was also believed to have fought other pantheon gods for the faith of individual people. But again, no mention of these gods in other Baltic tribes, so very difficult to confirm if real or just a figment of imagination. Let us return to the topic of the inconsistencies in the mythology. When we went to the Museum of Baltic Gods, we were more or less aware of what we were getting ourselves into. There were a large number of gods that we could not verify the legitimacy of in our research. It would make sense, as the entire park was established in the monetary sense by a conservative politician of Lithuania. Now, we are not saying that everything we saw there was falsified, as it was still somewhat accurate, especially with the depiction of the most important gods, such as Perkūnas, Velnias, or Saulė, but we, for instance, did not find a statue to Dievs, which is strange as according to archaeologists and historians, he might have been the most important deity. My personal theory would be that comparing Dievs, the Baltic god, to Dievas, the Christian god, could have been seen as blasphemous, and thus his status could have been altered by the early Christians. This opinion is based on the fact that the word for Dievs is closely related to the Indo-European word Deus, thus perhaps signifying to me that Christians actually picked that name from pagans rather than the other way around. But then again, this is just my opinion and you should take it with a grain of salt. To quote H. Biazas once more, and I really like this part from his article because it gives very good context about what the gods should and should not be. Quote, Baltic religion, typologically, is an agricultural religion, and it is useless to speculate whether any other basis, such as nomadism, hunting, or fishing, can be found for it, because no information regarding such possibilities can be derived from any source. End quote. In other words, we should try to make sense of what is presented to us, rather than trying to attach meaning to things that are less likely to have existed. Another quote. This religion does not recognize contemplation or mysticism, but rather exhibits a healthy rationalism. It would not make sense for the Balts to, a culture heavily dependent on the success of each year's harvest, to turn too much to their gods at every corner, as it could be the difference between starving and not starving. Comparing Lithuanian and Latvian Balts to the Prussian people, Prussian culture is the most lacking due to its people assimilating, and so any knowledge of the living traditions was not passed down generation through generation. There are some written works scribed down by the Christian missionaries and priests, and even in the chronicles of the Teutonic Order. However, these reports about the Prussian folklore must be taken with a grain of salt, since these recollections were biased. Pagan mythology, occult, and traditions were looked down upon by the Christians. Exploring Lithuanian and Latvian folklore, we have more concrete proof. This is thanks to the three key historical sources we are able to access today. Since the beginning of the Christianization, official German documents of the state and church have been preserved, documenting various laws and visitation protocols. The second, surprisingly, was the literature that arose from the need for the conquerors to learn and understand the local languages and culture, consisting of dictionaries and language lessons often containing important information about individual gods and the various traditions associated with them. And finally, we have the living tradition, passed down by Lithuanians and Latvians throughout tongue, and thus can trace its roots all the way back to ancient Balts. Most of the mythology we have, or at least the mythology that is taught to us in schools, comes from but a single series of books written by Theodoras Narbutas, a Lithuanian folklore explorer that explored Lithuanian folklore in the 19th century. Unfortunately, his books face harsh criticism today due to the lack of proof and overall making up of facts. If we did not have people thoroughly researching our own mythology, it is very likely that we would have an ancient Baltic religion that would be hardly distinguishable from that one of the Greeks or Romans. I feel like we discussed a great number of things on today's episode. Before we finish, I'd like to put out my own view on our mythology. Even though our mythology is lacking and is generally sometimes very difficult to prove or disprove, it is the one we have. To this day, it is still tradition for passing down folklore by word of mouth. Most Lithuanians will remember their grandparents telling them various stories of Kaukai, Babausi, or how we should close the door when it starts to rain because Dundulis might enter our home. I always had a soft spot towards our mythology, most likely passed down to me from my grandma, who passed a few years back. She was an avid storyteller, was very crafty, and used to make masks representative of the Baltic gods. I sometimes think that the way they lived encompasses what the Balts were all about. If you go around asking random Lithuanians in the streets, I'm sure they'll have stories very similar to my own, and I find that both beautiful and amazing. In conclusion, the Baltic religion is both rich and lacking. Rich in that we understand that it was in fact quite unique and very focused on agriculture, but lacking as it is very difficult to confirm anything or trace its roots. I think the biggest strength is that it is so deeply embedded into our current culture. Hopefully, it will keep getting passed on for years to come. This episode marks an end of the two-part series about Baltic culture and language. Next episode, we will be moving on to further discuss how the Baltic tribes developed. Thank you so much for listening, and a special thanks to all who are following us and rated our podcast. We can see that every day we have more listeners, and hopefully, with the introduction of our Instagram account, we can interact with you all. Do not hesitate to drop a question in our DM or on the episode itself. Have a great week, and until next time.